Right. Hello, everybody. This is the ClimbSci podcast with Brian Rigby.
Hey, everyone. And my co-host, Tom Herbert.
Hello, everybody. So tonight, or today, we're doing episode 7, which is part 2 of the recovery series that we're doing. And I urge you probably to listen to the first one, which was giving you the background to recovery and what its relation is to performance and what we're talking about. And it led us into basically now the applications. So what can we do to aid our recovery, and what are we specifically doing by these interventions?
Right. I didn't have anything more to say. I just wanted to look at that.
So this is just so you haven't noticed after the 7th episode is that this is not a highly polished affair. That we really do it as a conversation. So, anyways, so what we can think about is, in terms of our post, because we're not going to rehash a lot of what we spoke about in the first episode. So we're going to dive straight into this, into the nitty gritty here. So what we're looking at in terms of what I term the post-exercise recovery goals, right? As I'm saying that what we wanted to do is restoring the body losses caused by the first session to restore the performance for the next session. So that's the first point of why we're trying to recover. And then the second point is the promotion of the adaptive response to the exercise session. So that's the stress or the stimulus, the training effect, to make the body better at the features of the exercise that are important for performance. So that being is basically, we're trying to restore what has been used, the losses from the exercise, so that you can have those in place for the next exercise session. And then the other thing is this promotion of the adaptation that we were trying to do, which was the whole point of the training and the exercise in the first place. And these two things are really going to will circle what the whole of the talk today is going to circle these two things, because in the first case, we're looking to prepare ourselves to recover from the first session, to prepare ourselves for the second session. And that can be within the same day, or within even the same couple of hours, or in 24 hours, 48 hours, being ready for the next thing, even if it is a competition. And then the second part of it is we are recovering so that we can stimulate and get better as we progress through the training, our careers in climbing, if that makes sense.
Yeah, exactly. It's a spectrum what we're talking about here, and I don't really want to labor the point on it too much, because an entire episode can and should and probably will be done on training adaptation in the future. But we're talking about a spectrum, and you might be familiar with charts that essentially have like a line going up and then down and then up a little higher and down. But it's a difference between how much, like, the recovery plays a role both in our maximal performance, in that we're trying to recover certain systems, certain parts of our body that are necessary in order to perform at our highest level. But then we're also trying to force adaptations within those, which by necessity means not recovering fully. So we're looking at a spectrum here, where I think what Tom and I will really be talking about today is optimizing kind of within that middle of the spectrum. Because most of the time you're not necessarily looking for a 100% full recovery, but you are looking for a majority recovery. You don't want to be working out, every day or, twice a day without in, because you're not going to get the right type of adaptation. But we do want to make sure that you're adapting, or that you're recovering as quickly as possible without necessarily
or like burning out, basically.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Because when I mentioned this on the previous episode in talking about, the way that you train, and it really is about maximizing the training volume over time. And I briefly said that it was if you absolutely knacker yourself out in a single training session, meaning that you can't train or climb the next that week, then there really is no point of that first training session. That's really where you're trying to balance the load.
Right.
And so recovery comes into play with that, is that the better you can recover, the better, the more volume of training that you can put in, and the better the quality of training. But there's some interesting considerations here, is that there is a way that there are ways that you can recover that may impact this long-term adaptations.
Right. And we will dig a lot into that in a few moments. By a few moments, I mean probably about half an hour, knowing how much we talk. But that is a major concern when we're talking about recovery. That recovery, in the sense of returning to maximum performance, or just being able to exercise, train, whatever, at what you might say is your standard or your optimal level, and recovering but also gaining these adaptations, those are two different things. And sometimes things affect one and simultaneously decrease the other, in which case there's an argument that we can make about whether those are really good recovery mechanisms.
Right. So I've got 3 considerations that I put here. Again, just in terms of an overview. So this should be an obvious one, but basically your recovery strategies and your amount of recovery strategies are going to be related to how much you work. So for instance, if you're doing a light exercise session, you're not going to require the same level or the same post-exercise strategy. And that mainly is going to come into play with the amount of food that you're going to be eating post-session. There is some consideration about foregoing some recovery for the sake of these long-term adaptations, which we mentioned. And then, yes, basically some strategies that will actually impact that. So what I've got here is I came up with what I call now this is terrible because I can't actually pronounce R very well. So this is the worst thing that I could have designed to do on a podcast. But anyway, what I called them.
Is this a British thing?
No, this is me not being able to use my tongue to say R properly. So I have to say it out of the side of my mouth. So the recovery Re's, which I call them, are refueling, rehydration, rebuilding, and rebalancing. And just to sum those up, so refueling, we're looking at in terms of the food and supplements that are coming in. Rehydration would be water and electrolytes. The rebuilding would be protein and some carbohydrate. And rebalancing would be things that are related to inflammation, immunity, antioxidants. So let's start with, Brian, what you're calling basically the recovery of the systems.
Sure. This actually stems from a question that I got on Climbing Nutrition in regards to the last episode of ClimbSci that we had on recovery. Steve wrote that he wanted a brief overview of what exactly is recovering. He thought it would be useful. So in other words, like what energy systems, tissue repair, etc. So I called it systems recovering or systems recovery because we're looking at a number of systems that we're trying to bring back from a depleted level to a non-depleted level. So we're looking at like creatine phosphate. This is probably the most rapid system to recover. Just even within exercise, it takes approximately 4 minutes before 100% of your spent creatine is rephosphorylated back into creatine and phosphate. So it doesn't take that long, although it should be noted that as you continue using that system over time, it's going to recover slower and slower. Part of the reason why we fatigue faster as we exercise more and more. We're also looking at the glycolytic system. So this would be both the aerobic system and anaerobic glycolysis. Anaerobic would be the splitting of the glucose into pyruvate, and then ultimately, which then gets reduced down to lactate. But once we spend these molecules, particularly once we reduce them to lactate, we need to recover that lactate. And it's not that lactate, this isn't, as I think we talked a bit about last episode, I'm not talking about lactic acidosis. I'm simply talking about recovering this fuel source. Lactate is still a fuel that contains the majority of the energy that was once stored in the glucose molecule, but it's not accessible in its current form, at least not to most of the cells in our body. Some of the cells, like our red blood cells, can use lactate, but the cells that we're concerned with, like muscle cells, are not going to use lactate nearly as much, or really in any discernible amount compared to glucose. So we need to recover that lactate. We need to turn it back into glucose, which happens in the liver. Those are things that happen over the creatine happens on a very short timeline. The glycolytic recovery, the lactate recovery is going to happen in still a pretty short timeline across the next few hours, across a day. We also have some aerobic fat oxidation. And normally you wouldn't say that we need to restore our fat stores because we have quite a bit of fat on our body. However, we do actually store some fat within our muscles just because it gives it easy access. It doesn't require a transporter anymore. Fat transport through our body, fat not being water soluble, requires a transporter protein in order to reach our cells outside of the adipose tissue. So that's a limiting factor. And particularly for endurance athletes, they end up with higher amounts of intramuscular fat stores, and those fat stores are depleted after exercise. They must be rejuvenated actually using the other fat stores within our body. Once we're done exercising, then we no longer have the same demand for the fat transporter proteins. And then there's also muscular repair, which I guess we could call this amino acid repair or protein repletion. In the sense that when we exercise, depending on the length of it, we will potentially break down muscle tissue to use those amino acids as fuel, as a conversion, a molecule to convert back into glucose, gluconeogenesis. We'll also suffer a certain amount of cellular damage. And then there's, of course, the growth and adaptation that we're looking for from any of our training. So all those require amino acids. I lumped it all under muscular repair. So those are the main systems that we're looking at here: creatine phosphate, glycolytic, some oxidative fat, and then amino acids. There's also, just very briefly, there's some other systems that we might be looking at as well. Circulatory system, we're going to have a little bit of recovery from some exercises or some types of training induce red blood cell damage, hemolysis. It breaks the cells apart, so we're going to need to recover those. And there's also neural fatigue, potentially, where neurons aren't firing quite how they would be at the start of exercise. So that's another system that's going to need to recover, although that latter one is a lot less established, a lot less understood. So not going to focus on that at all.
Okay, good. So I wonder if we should do it this way, is that let's do it like a kind of narrative story of someone who is going to be doing a training session. So let's say someone is, let's just take bouldering, for instance. So you're in a bouldering gym and you've got 2 hours to do a number of problems. Plus you want to do a little bit of body weight training afterwards. So let's say when you're trying a problem, everybody knows that you can't repeatedly do the same work at the same intensity, that you are required to take some sort of rest.
Right.
So do you want to talk about this acute short-term recovery?
Yeah. As Tom said, it's pretty clear to everyone, regardless of your understanding of exercise science, that you can't make a strong attempt on a problem, fail that problem, and immediately get back on and try it again and expect to do better. You need to recover. And a big part of that short-term recovery is the rephosphorylation of creatine back to creatine phosphate. Creatine is exhausted rapidly by exercise. Most most papers state that we get maybe like 5 to 10 seconds out of our creatine phosphate system. It's, I think, a lot more complicated than that when we're looking at something like climbing, which involves letting go of holds and, you know, a lot of these very short kind of intermittent exercise, in a sense, intermittent muscle use, and isometric contraction is a little bit more complicated. But at the very least, we know that we're going to, if you give a good strong attempt on a problem and it's not like you know, fall off on the first move, but you're on the wall for 10 plus seconds, chances are you have exhausted or severely depleted your creatine, your phosphagen system. Most of the creatine has been dephosphorylated. It's now just regular old creatine. Doesn't do anything. You need to rephosphorylate back into creatine phosphate in order to use it again. Thankfully, that system recovers rapidly. So it'll be 50% recovered by 30 seconds within after that attempt. But if you want full recovery, then that takes about 4 minutes. And if you imagine it's a logarithmic curve. So the less time has elapsed, the faster that recovery is. So for example, 50% of it will be recovered after 30 seconds, roughly 85% will be recovered after a minute, roughly 95% will be recovered after 2 minutes, and by 4 minutes, pretty much 100% has recovered. So you don't necessarily need to give 4 minutes in between your best attempts, but you do need to give at least 2 minutes if you want to be able to, if you want to expect to do the same on it. And again, right now, what I'm talking about is just maximum performance. I'm not talking about essentially trying to adapt or stimulate training gains or training adaptation. This is simply if you are working on a project, something you really want to send, and you're looking to maximally recover, you're going to need about 4 minutes, 3 to 4 minutes.
Yeah, and that's a really important point, because again, this goes to the kind of the reason of what you're doing at that specific time. So, you know, if your goal for the session is really to send some problem that you've been working on, then you're wanting to have quality attempts, and this is where you're going to be in a far better position if you give yourself this kind of minimal 2 minute rest between attempts. I know some people I've spoken to, and I've done it myself, but more when I do more endurance stuff, is to have a stopwatch or use your watch, because it's really weird, because if you subjectively try and factor 2 minutes, you'll find that you're short by about 1.5 minutes. 30 seconds or like a minute feels very long when you're really excited about trying to finish a problem. So I think it's really worthwhile is actually taking yourself a stopwatch or something, so that if you're trying a hard problem, you want to try it with the best quality and the best power that you can. So give yourself this 2 minutes, and if you know, if you can wait longer, then that's better. More quality attempts are going to be better than multiple, you know, poor attempts. Right. This is a different thing, though. Of course, if you're trying to elicit some sort of training response, and again, I think we'll leave that sort of stuff to another podcast. But you can easily think about it that if you're trying, if your purpose of the session is to train something, then you're not necessarily wanting to recover the whole time, unless it's something like power training, right? If you're trying to do power training, you want to recover.
Right. So, we get this whole complicated flow chart of what is your goal?
That's right. Yeah, that's right.
Is your goal adaptation? Move to this way. Yeah. And it should also be noted that creatine's not the only thing that we're worried about.
Of course.
There's a number of other things that we're talking about. I use creatine as kind of a broad stroke, because most of the systems that we're concerned with, most of the reasons that you're fatigued after a problem that you need to recover from are going to resolve within the same time frame. But you know, if you're climbing, particularly if you're doing something a little bit, climbing a longer problem, if you're sport climbing, then you're also going to have hydrogen ion buildup within the muscles. You're going to need to clear those hydrogen ions out again. Essentially, you're going to have to run energy through the aerobic system to recover to get rid of those ions and recover some of your other energy stores so that you're ready for another go. Those are all going to recover within a very similar time frame as this creatine. back to creatine phosphate, in that it's going to take a minimum of 2 minutes to really be able to give another solid go, but upwards of 3 to 5 to get back to 100%, or sometimes even longer, because the thing with creatine is it's easily measured curve, but when we're talking about something like hydrogen ion clearance, it's going to really depend a lot more on what you're actually doing and just other physiological variables that make it a little bit harder to measure from person to person.
Yeah. So,
or I should say average.
And
to adapt any specific person.
Yeah. So if we stay with this kind of scenario of this person climbing, so again, part of the recovery, this acute recovery, can be exactly what a lot of people are doing, which is shaking out their arms, right? And what we're trying to do there is deal with the pump. We're trying to bring back the blood flow into the arm, to bring back the nutrients, to restore the creatine, to bring more glucose back in, and also to pull out things like the hydrogen ions and things like that. So that's why shaking does work. And there are different methods, either shaking above your head or shaking below your heart. I've not really looked into that much research in terms of which one is actually better. But again, there's the other thing with that is whether or not you want to be shaking out or getting rid of the pump. So having that pump can actually improve some training adaptations.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, if you're training to develop more muscular endurance, it's not by trying to alleviate essentially by trying to decrease the factor that endurance plays in your climbing, you're no longer training that system as strongly as you would be.
Yeah. So here's an easy way to think about it. Like, say you were doing endurance training, but you were basically spending, I don't know, like 30 seconds in a resting position after every 2 moves. The endurance effect is probably going to be much lower than if you were to have a better pace and keep climbing. So this is the thing. It's kind of tricky because you've got this like recovery continuum of what you're trying to do here, and that's really why I always say is have a goal when you're going into a session, so that you can really maximize what you're trying to do. So let's talk a little bit about since we're on creatine, let's talk a little bit about creatine supplementation, even though I would recommend people to go to our supplements episode, which I think might have been episode 5, to have a more detailed thing. Do you want to just briefly cover that, Brian?
Yeah, sure. If you listen to the supplements episode, we make, I think, a lot of compelling reasons for why a climber should take creatine. Recovery in between attempts on a problem, not necessarily as well backed by research. There's a little bit of research that suggests that creatine, because it increases your intramuscular creatine phosphate stores, will improve recovery between sets, but there's also a lot of research that suggests it doesn't really. Again, there's a lot of great reasons to take creatine, increased power being notable among them, but you're not necessarily going to decrease the amount of time between max go attempts if you take creatine. And it should also be noted that, again, creatine is just one of the systems that we're trying to recover short term. If you take creatine phosphate, it's not going to help you clear hydrogen ions at a more rapid rate, or at least not a significantly more rapid rate between attempts. So every other system is you still require that same return of blood flow, the same oxygen, the same running of the aerobic systems to recover. So creatine doesn't really do a lot in this one case.
So in my first R from my recovery rees, we talked about refueling, and so we've covered creatine here. So let's talk about really the big one, which is the carbohydrate glycogen. So let's talk about in terms of the acute recovery. So does consuming carbohydrate during a session help recover the glycogen for repeated bouts?
Probably not to a significant extent. Now, this again, listen a little longer, because carbs during a session are going to be supremely helpful. But when we're working out, we're in a very much catabolic state, and doing something like replenishing glycogen stores is an anabolic thing. It's an anabolic trigger. So it's unlikely that you're going to experience a lot, unless you're resting for 15 plus minutes in between. You're probably not regenerating glycogen. That being said, pardon me. That being said, when you consume carbohydrates, you are providing another energy source other than your muscle glycogen for your body to rely on. And so you're going to deplete your glycogen slightly more slowly. And just in general, you're going to, the recovery time might feel shorter to you, just because you're able to exercise for so much longer at a higher strength, that even though maybe if you gave yourself the same amount of recovery time, you'd actually recover even more than what you would without that carbohydrate. But you're not actually recovering faster. You're just simply at a higher strength. You got more energy to accomplish more. And so you'll be able to make do with a shorter recovery time, even though if you actually were able to, maybe pull a digital printout of what your body's recovery level was at, it would be at the same percentage-wise, but that percentage-wise as a percentage of total strength is higher, if that makes sense. It was a little bit convoluted, I think.
Yeah, so we're talking about free glucose coming into the system that can be used for immediate energy, even by the brain, nervous system, the muscles as well. And that's going to be obviously impacting the glycogen use, but also it's going to impact this feedback loop, which I'm going to talk a little bit later about in terms of the kind of the brain's effect on fatigue and perceptions of fatigue, which can be improved by having basically a greater abundance of energy in the body at one time. It's really just, it's like I said, it's a feedback. So consuming carbs during the workout. So we're consuming carbs during the workout is going to most likely impact your feelings of recovery, as Brian said. But it's unlikely that that's going to be restoring glycogen in the muscles during that time, and I'm not sure whether it has any impact on liver glycogen. It may do, but I can't say for sure.
I think it would depend on the type of carbohydrate you're consuming. I mean, like something like fructose, if you were for some reason consuming pure fructose, like from your sports drink, then that's 100% going to be made into liver glycogen, just because your body can't do anything else with it. Sure. But if it's glucose entering the system, I would guess that it's going to forego liver glycogen creation. I mean, the thing is, your body, when you're exercising, your body has a use for all these molecules of glucose that you're supplying it. So it's not going to spend energy to turn them into a long-term storage form just so that it can break that storage form back down and give you that glucose molecule back. That's adding two steps that are both unnecessary just to get back to the exact same place that it started.
Exactly. And the same can be said for BCAAs.
Yeah. Yep, that is true.
But we won't. We'll leave that one. We'll leave that one.
Yeah.
Okay. So right. Okay. So let's talk about.
Well, let's.
So are we talking? Yeah. Carry on.
Well, maybe we can just right now. We so far we've just kind of been looking at this 0 minute to 5 minute time frame within recovery. Right. Like you're done with a problem, and now you're going to try that problem again in a short period of time. is there anything you can really do to decrease the amount of time within that 5-minute window?
Is there? Are you answering?
It was somewhat rhetorical.
Okay, so are we talking about? So what is the time frame we're talking now? So is this after the session has finished, or
nope,
still
we're
within the
still
session?
in that 5-minute. We're talking about like the time crunched climber who has 1 hour over their lunch break, and they're trying to send their project within that hour. Is there anything they can do to get more attempts out of it, or are they stuck with this like 3-minute to 5-minute between max attempt window? Is there anything they can do to shorten that window?
I don't know if this is a leading question.
I'm not trying to lead you. I realize that it sounds like I'm trying to trick you or something. I'm not. I from what I've seen, there's nothing you can really do to affect that super short-term window. You can indirectly affect it by like consuming carbohydrates, consuming creatine. You can kind of increase your power. Even you could say like for some types of climbing, beta alanine would help, but there's nothing you can really do to change that short-term recovery window.
I suppose what you could say again,
just within this 2 to 5 minute range.
Okay. Yeah.
0 to 5 minutes if you want to break recovery down to the moment you get off the wall.
Yeah. I mean, I would add one thing which I think you can do, and I'll talk a little bit more about this in detail later, but in terms of your breathing rate and your heart rate, is if you can when you're doing a problem, you're going to be in this very kind of hyperactive stress, state. That's what you need. You need that hyper ability at the time. But once you're coming off that, you want to go back to as best kind of parasympathetic state as you can without falling asleep, of course. So one of the things that you can do is try and slow everything down. You've done your attempt. Now sit down, relax, breathe in a paced way, calm yourself down. It's also going to help you to look at the problem, to reevaluate something, for you to understand maybe what you could have done better or change, reread the route, and yeah, that's ours. And so being in that kind of that physiological, that more rested state, that calmer state is gonna help. And the better you can do that, and the quicker you can do that, the better you'll be able to switch between being kind of calm and collected and being incredibly powerful and focused. And this probably goes even more so for people doing competition. You've only got 2 minutes there, right? So
that is fair. And I think particularly like for competition, I wasn't even thinking of that, just because I typically come off the wall and I don't have like the same level of agitation maybe that some people have.
You're very zen.
Like this, I'm not very zen, but like you look around the climbing gym, you can see examples of like people fall on a spectrum between how like upset, how emotional they are after attempts. And what Tom's saying is you kind of want to bring yourself back to this neutral. You want to be able to let go of the tension so that your body can actually recover in a more rapid state. And if you're in a higher stress situation like a competition, then that's going to be something you're going to have to work a lot more actively on versus if you're just like chilling with a couple of your friends and there's no tension and you're not climbing anything that you really care about. You're just having fun. You're probably not coming down off the wall fretting about what you're going to do next time.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so let's talk about, I mean, I don't think this applies so much to climbers than it does longer endurance events, but we can talk about hydration in a general sense. I think it's unlikely for people to be dehydrated during climbing, unless maybe you're going out and you're going to the crag and you're spending a lot of time getting there and then doing a longer climb then yes, obviously you're.
Yeah. How hot does it get there in
the
in the
UK?
UK?
Well, we've had 3 days at like 28, 29, and 26.
That's pretty
But
warm.
that's the 3 days of summer we have. But yeah, I mean,
I'll say for where we are here in Colorado, that it's not uncommon for me to hear people talking about how little water they brought to the crag and how they end up getting dehydrated. You know, a lot of our approaches are like an hour to 2 hours long. So you already have a long approach, and then it's hot and you're sweating, and people don't like carrying weight. You know, we're all climbers. We're not, most of us aren't endurance athletes. So most people are opting to carry as little as possible. And I've heard and I've witnessed many times people just bringing inadequate amounts of water. So I would say that dehydration is actually a potentially serious problem, at least in this part of the US.
Oh, good. Well, there we go. I mean, so yeah. Yeah, I think that answers it. I mean, do you know, this one thing I put down as a bullet point, but I actually didn't do enough research on it, is in terms of, do you see much reason to be more specific with electrolytes in terms of supplementation with that? Or are you taking a whole food approach, which is kind of
it kind of depends on, I guess, on what the outing is. I'll usually bring at least one water bottle with salt water in it, which my friends never cease to ridicule me about when they inevitably take a swig of my water and wonder why it's somewhat salty. I guess my feeling on it is that the only real electrolyte that we're in need of replacing most likely is sodium and the chloride that goes along with it. It's not like we're losing a ton of potassium or magnesium or calcium. So I don't worry about those. Those I'm 100% confident I can get back from my food. The sodium, it depends on what you're bringing. But I think that you're always safe as an athlete with no medical conditions that might prevent you from consuming a high sodium diet. You're always safe with a little bit more sodium in your water, just to ensure that your blood volume stays expanded while you're climbing. You know, hydrated. We could, I don't know. We should start giving our listeners a dime every time that we say we could do this in another episode. But we could talk about hydration in a whole other episode.
Yeah, maybe we'll do that.
Suffice to say, hydration is more complicated than just putting liquid into your body. Like, we're really talking about keeping your cells and both the within the cells and the intracellular and the extracellular fluid. We're talking about keeping that at an optimal level, and that requires electrolytes. And the main electrolyte you're going to lose is sodium. And so, if you put some salt into your water, you're unlikely to lose that extracellular volume, and you might not need it. I'm not going to say that everyone needs to do this, because there's certainly, we adapt. It's not like if you don't put salt in your water, you're going to suffer from hyponatremia. That's most likely not going to happen. It could happen, but most likely won't, because our body's pretty good at adapting, especially over the course of a period of hot days when you're sweating a lot. Your body will adapt and release sodium off your bones. But there's no harm. Salt is extremely cheap. You don't need that much of it into your water. And if you put it there, you're guaranteed that you're going to keep your extracellular volume, your blood, at a greater volume. And anything that you don't need, you're just going to excrete harmlessly. It's really not a problem.
Yeah. So, I mean, in terms of the guidelines of kind of post-exercise recovery supplementation, in terms of salt and water, you're looking at about 0.25 grams of salt and about 500 mils of liquid. So the easiest way to do this is actually to have it as part of your post-recovery meal, right? So, I mean, you're basically salting the food that you're eating for recovery, plus drinking something. So, you know, if we're looking at carbohydrate and protein after, then that can easily include either a sports drink for the carbohydrate, or a meal where you just salt your foods with, your typical amount of salt. So it's not a lot of salt for this sort of thing.
Right.
Okay. So, right. I think we've covered the acute recovery. So let's now talk about the period straight after your training or your climbing session, and how to maximize your recovery to be ready for your next session, which could be the next day, or 48 hours, 72 hours later.
Could even be 8 hours later.
Yes, that is true.
Morning, evening session. The point is you're spending more than 5 minutes off the wall now. You're spending hours off of the wall.
Right. So let's talk about, so this is now, again, this is now crossing over the refueling part of my recovery rees and the rebuilding part of my recovery rees. So let's take the big one first. So we're talking about now is what you should be eating to maximize your recovery. So should we take this? I suppose should we take this in terms of the general recovery rather than training adaptation?
Yeah. And I think we can kind of take top down. I mean, what's the number one thing that we need for recovery? Just broadly speaking.
So we're looking at carbohydrates, really.
I was going to say calories first, but
okay, yeah, right. So expand.
But then yes, carbohydrates right after that.
Okay.
Well, recovery takes energy. Everything that you have depleted is going to require energy to be refueled, restocked, or repaired. And so the number one thing that you're going to need above anything else is calories. Like if you are potentially a ketogenic athlete, you're not going to eat carbohydrates right afterwards, but that doesn't mean that you don't want to consume energy. You still need extra energy in order to maximally recover. And that energy is going to mostly come from fat in that case. Now, we're going to talk about the ketogenic diet at another time. I just was using that as an example of somebody who wouldn't need carbohydrates to recover. But for most people, for most climbers, carbohydrates are the source of calorie that you're going to want. And the primary reason for that is because you've exhausted your muscle glycogen stores across your training and you need to recover them now.
Yeah, and obviously within reason, depending on how much you've done. So when we use the term exhausted, we don't mean in the fullest sense. We're just saying that you're within the local muscle, whatever you've been doing, you have reduced your glycogen content of that muscle to various degrees, and to perform for your next session, it's optimal to restore that glycogen back to its same levels. Right.
So it takes a bit of time to do this. You can't do it across only a single hour or even 2 hours. From what I've read, it would take a minimum of about 8 hours to fully recover your muscle glycogen stores, and you'd have to be pretty dedicated to consuming carbohydrates in that 8-hour period. This is actually perhaps more of a focus for a competition climber or if you're camping at a crag and you've only got, like you're trying to do all your recovery overnight, you're going to need to consume a lot of carbohydrate within a short period of time just to make sure that you have all of your muscle glycogen refueled. If you are going to have 24 hours, then you don't really need any specific dietary strategy, provided that your carbohydrates content of your diet is normal. You're probably going to fully recover your stores within 24 hours. But yes, the less time you have to recover your muscle glycogen, the more you need to actually focus on eating carbohydrate-rich foods.
Yeah. So yeah, that's exactly it. Is that it? Again, it depends on the context of how quick you're needing to recover. So in terms of carbohydrate amount, so funny enough, what's interesting about Brian's comment about energy first is that there is some research that has shown that let me back up a little bit. So in terms of what appears to be roughly the recommendation for carbohydrate per hour to restore muscle glycogen, we're looking at about 1.2 grams per kilogram per hour, right? So, and this kind of makes sense because you can only absorb glucose from the gut at about 60 grams an hour.
Right.
So
an additional 30 grams from fructose.
Right. So, and just a point on that, this is why something like sucrose, as in table sugar, which is roughly 50% fructose, 50% glucose, is actually a very good very good carbohydrate to consume to restore glycogen very quickly, because the fructose and glucose have two different transporters that allow it to go through the gut so you can maximize what's going through the gut. Plus, the fructose is going to go straight to the liver to restore the liver glycogen, while the glucose then gets spared for the muscle glycogen. But yeah, so what the guidelines basically say is that by consuming roughly a gram per kilogram of your body weight per hour is going to really optimize things. What's interesting, and the reason I mention this now, is that there has been studies showing that when you consume less than that, so that you're potentially at an energy deficit, your glycogen restoration is actually slower. So if you were to consume, let's say, it's kind of a weird thing, but if you're consuming, say, 30 grams of carbohydrate per hour, and nothing else, then your energy is not going to be restored. Your energy balance is going to be impacted, which is going to impact glycogen recovery. And that's why they've given people protein with this low amount of carbohydrate, and it's actually restored glycogen quicker than without the protein. And that has been related to things like leucine, increasing insulin, which we've spoken about in the carbohydrate podcast and things like that. So, but this is a very it's unlikely that unless you don't have access to any food, this is something not really to be too concerned about. But the main thing is that you want to be consuming carbohydrate after your training at various amounts and various timings, dependent on how much time you have between your sessions of climbing. So if you've got 2 or 3 hours between important sessions, then what you're looking at is you're wanting to be consuming probably faster digesting carbohydrates, so basically more sugary things, and probably pacing it around about 60 to 80 grams every hour leading up to that event. And that's really probably going to be maximizing your restoration. Consuming kind of lower or kind of more starchier, fiber-rich carbohydrates is going to slow that down. And basically it's because the glucose is going to be digested and absorbed much slower because it's being released slower. So, ideally, if you're trying to recover very quickly, then you want to choose kind of faster digesting carbohydrates. That's why sports drinks exist, is because that's what they were aiming to try and do, is that rapid recovery. In terms of total carbohydrate intake, so we know that basically after 24 hours, glycogen stores are recovered unless you're doing a specifically low carbohydrate diet. But even then, after 24 hours, the levels are fairly are not that low compared to eating a high carbohydrate diet. So in terms of amounts, so before we were talking about roughly 5 grams per kilogram per day total. And if you're really wanting to try and maximize things, then you could probably double that. But 10 grams, like above 10 grams, there's really no reason. And the reason being is that climbers are not depleting things at the same level as high endurance athletes. But basically, it's unless you're specifically choosing to restrict carbohydrate leading up to your next session, it's unlikely that you're going to be depleted of glycogen going into your next session.
Right. Yeah. Concisely put, the less time you have to recover, the more carbohydrate you need to eat in that short period of time. You need to condense the amount of carbohydrate you would normally consume in 24 hours into an 8-hour period.
Yeah, that's right. So, okay. I'm just scanning through my notes here, see if there's anything. I just say here, total carbohydrate intake is more important than the time strategy.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, don't get too hung up on like setting a timer for every hour. Just make sure that you're getting enough. That's more of a concern. If you consume 160 carbohydrates after it, right away, and then you wait 2 hours, then that's just as good as consuming 80 right away and then another 80 in another hour.
Yeah.
Your gut carbohydrates they're not going to pass all the way through your digestive window for absorption until at least 4 hours if it's a solid food. If it's a liquid, it's a shorter period of time, but if you're using liquids, then you're probably able to consume a lot more anyway. It's going to be a little less concern. But yeah, if you have like a giant meal of sweet potatoes, as I often do, then as a means to recover glycogen, then you've got 4+ hours where you're going to be potentially absorbing those carbs. So even if there's 240 grams of carbs in there, you're probably going to absorb all of them across that period of time.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so let's go to the next one. So part of the rebuilding of my recovery reads is protein. This is really the main one here.
Yeah.
So what is the importance of protein in this kind of post-exercise period?
Well, there's a couple of pieces of import. First, as we discussed in the protein episode, protein, the leucine, the amino acid leucine within it is an actual trigger. So just by exercising, you're also triggering muscle protein synthesis. You're priming your body to want to do this, but the leucine is also going to add another level to that. So consuming protein after a workout, and I don't mean to make this sound like it's a time dependent thing. There's no like specific time window here again, but if you consume protein sometime after a workout, you're getting leucine, which is priming your body even further, triggering that much further muscle protein synthesis and letting your body know, hey, we've got materials we need to repair, restore, and build upon. And then the other thing about protein is it's obviously it's a source of materials. So we talked a little bit about this. Going to bring BCAAs up once again. You can't just take BCAAs and get muscle growth. And you can't do that because there's no actual building blocks of muscle in them aside from the leucine, isoleucine, and valine. But your muscles aren't just made out of those 3 amino acids. You need all the amino acids, and you get those from dietary protein, and then also through endogenous synthesis of some of the non-essential ones. But even those require nitrogen input, and that nitrogen comes from our diet in the form of protein.
Yeah. So we go to this at length on the protein podcast, and the more and more research comes out that basically says that the total protein intake for the whole day appears to be the greatest determinant in terms of muscle growth, and I suppose we could put in small brackets recovery. But there is enough data to say that there is a potentially more optimal way of eating, which falls in line with general common sense, and that is that you're not wanting to consume all your protein in a single meal. It seems, in terms of what is most optimal, that you're looking at this kind of, depending on how big you are as a person, 20 to 40 grams per meal, which is what you're typically getting. So for instance, let's say a chicken breast is you're getting about 40 grams of protein for that meal. So if you're taking your total protein intake, which we generally recommend to be about 1.6 grams per kilogram body weight, you're going to be splitting that up into 3 to 4 meals. So if you're having a training day, it would make sense to just place one of those meals immediately after your training.
Yeah, you're going to be hungry anyway.
Yeah, exactly. So that normally ends up being something like a protein shake, like a whey or vegetable source protein shake, because that can be something that you can carry with you to the to wherever you're climbing. So there is there used to be an idea that you had a window of opportunity straight after your training called this kind of anabolic window, that if you missed, you would have lost this opportunity. You know, on the
So many workouts wasted because people didn't eat right afterwards.
exactly, and you know, people used to get very passionate about this, and you know, make sure that they down a shake within minutes of dropping the barbell.
Right. Yeah.
We're in on the website on climbsci.com. I'll post a link to basically a paper that really talks about this anabolic window, and really that it's not that important at all. That this anabolic window is like 24 hours. Not
it's a very large window.
Yeah. So in briefly, what we're looking at is what would be optimal, and which is what I recommend to my own clients, is that in relative to the total amount of protein that I've given as a target for the person, you're looking at about 30 to 40 grams of high quality protein after your training session, and ideally I would say within about an hour or something. And it's just because you're in an optimal place to have the amino acids coming in. You want to have the energy coming in. So having a meal or a kind of supplement type affair is just a good, it's a good place to put that in and start kicking off this recovery as soon as possible. And this goes back to what we're trying to do here, is if we're trying to get ourselves back into the best state that we can for the next session, then you want to start your recovery as soon as possible. And that's going to be straight after your training.
Yeah. But again, you know, this is more about, in a lot of ways, convenience. And depending on how long you have before your next workout, it becomes more or less important to, you know, immediately eat. But really, at the end of the day, we're talking about like getting enough in terms of carbohydrates, in terms of protein. It's the amount that's going to count more than the precise timing of it. And then the less time you have to recover, the more timing matters. You can't not eat anything for 12 hours and expect to have recovered if you're going to climb again in 8 hours.
Okay. Right. So I've, in terms of my little immediately after training recommendation, I've got here 30 to 45 grams of protein, 50 to 100 grams of carbohydrate, 0.25 grams of salt, and 500 mils of fluid. So that's my little go-to in terms of an easy thing to think about. Okay, so this should be an interesting one. So let's talk about vitamins and minerals, the kind of typical type of supplements that people might take.
Yeah. Now we're I think we're moving beyond, you know, right before we were talking about macronutrients, we're talking about the calorie containing ones. We know that calories and these building block materials are necessary for recovery. These are things that we've depleted and that we need to recover, or that we, you know, are trying to store extra of, both in terms of carbohydrate and protein potentially. Now we're talking about these micronutrients, so things that are going to have much subtler effects, because these micronutrients always have subtle effects. That's part of their deal. And here I think it gets kind of interesting, because we've seen, I don't think we see it I don't know about over there in the UK, but I don't see it as much anymore. But there was this whole phase when people were obsessed with antioxidants, as athletes were obsessed with antioxidants, and there were like workout shakes or things that just very purposefully included either purified versions of these vitamins, like vitamin C and vitamin E, or they contained powderized vegetables, essentially like powderized greens, for the exact same purpose. And there was this whole, they weren't doing this for no reason. They were doing this because there were some studies that noticed that if you consume a lot of antioxidants, I mean, when you exercise, you have an increase in reactive oxygen species, the creation of them. And to get rid of them, what do you need? You need antioxidants. And so this whole theory that we could get rid of this oxidative stress caused by these reactive oxygen species by increasing our antioxidant load. And so we did that. And we never really had like great data to say that it was doing anything positive. But what we did eventually find was that they might actually harm adaptation. So the whole reason you're trying to adapt, because none of these supplements are going to, or none of these antioxidants are going to increase performance acutely in the moment. So the only thing that we could possibly hope that they would do is decrease recovery time, which it doesn't really appear that they do, but they simultaneously also decrease adaptation. So it wouldn't even matter, right? Because if you're training and you're trying to recover, you recover in between, and you decrease the amount of time you recover, but you also decrease how much you got out of that training session, then you haven't actually changed anything.
Yeah. Right?
So
the easiest way to think about it is this thing of, and this is going to go into our next section, so I'll just briefly mention it. So when part of the training effect, when we're putting our bodies under a stress, is that we are releasing various biochemicals into the system, or because of the breakdown of various molecules for energy and for signaling, etc., other metabolites are building up. And it's these metabolites that are signaling for the body to adapt, so that for the local tissue to adapt. So the same way that you need to progressively increase the load when you're strength training, so that you're causing an adaptation. It's the same thing with these, not the same thing, but it's similar in terms of these metabolites, is that these metabolites build up in the muscle tissue or other tissues that signal that training has occurred, and so the body must adapt. And this is where it can become a problem, because if you want to acutely recover, say because you're going to be having another session that same day, or specifically say a competition, then you're wanting to do all you can to try and clear this mess out of your muscles, so that you can perform again, because these metabolites are going to impact fatigue. They're going to impact local energy usage and power production in the tissues, i.e. think about the pump in your forearm, right? You want to recover, you want to get rid of that pump so you can carry on climbing. You want to get rid of that burn so you can carry on climbing. But what you don't want to do is come in with various things that are going to basically interrupt that signaling, meaning that if you start using high dose antioxidants straight after climbing, you can basically clear the oxidative stress in the muscle, which may acutely be good for repeated bouts of training or performance. But in terms of long-term adaptation, we've seen this, and particularly in endurance sports, this actually hampers long-term adaptation. And what it's doing is that you're taking some of the signaling away from the training, meaning you're doing the training, you're building up the signaling for adaptation, and now you're applying something like a supplement that's going to remove some of that signaling. And this is why it's almost like you're reducing your training volume, because of the biochemical mess that you're removing. The same thing, and Brian will talk about this next, in terms of inflammation. This is a very tricky thing, is that inflammation, I'm just looking at the notes here. Hold on. Brian's flashing the notes at me here.
I'm not flashing the notes. I'm just... So basically, exactly. We're talking about the hyper doses of these antioxidants are not beneficial for long-term adaptation, and they've gone out of vogue anyway. You used to be able to buy big sachets of vitamin C
and things like that. You may be able to still buy it. But what we're saying is, and the data is saying, is that taking this after every session is not a good idea. In fact, it could be making impeding your training gains. What I don't know, and maybe Brian does know, before I talk about inflammation, is do you know the time period? So let's talk about in terms of taking a high dose vitamin C, like in a multivitamin or a Berocca or something like that. Do you know how far away from the training it would be potentially be safe to take that? Oh, are you still there? Okay, Brian has disappeared. So I don't, to be honest, I don't actually know, and maybe I'll try and find that for the show notes. But if you're somebody who likes, if you do take a multivitamin or something like that, yeah, I'll find out for you how far away it would be beneficial, or it won't mitigate that the training adaptation. What Brian is most likely going to talk about would have been that consuming whole foods that contain antioxidants. So we're talking about fruits and vegetables. This has not been shown to have an impact because the amounts that you're getting in your vegetables are going to be far less than the amounts that you would get in a supplement. So, we would always say that, don't worry about consuming, fruit and leafy green veg because you feel that you're going to get too much vitamin C. That's not going to be the case. It really is just, super dosing on purified vitamin C or vitamin E and things like that straight after training is not a good idea. Potentially, it could be beneficial if, say, you're doing a competition and the next day you're training or it's very close together, then maybe something like that could benefit you. But I don't know enough data on that. Unfortunately, it looks like Brian has completely now disconnected. So I'm going to carry on slowly for the sake of the listener. And if it takes too long, then I will probably wait till he comes back, and then I'll edit this and chop it together. So, okay. So bear with us, folks. Sorry. Just seeing if I can find him. We need like a little musical interlude here. Okay, so yeah, I've just called him on chat, and he is just reconnecting shortly. Okay, so yeah, let me talk a little bit about inflammation because it goes into what I already said earlier. So the response to training is going to be an inflammatory response. Inflammation is not some sort of negative thing that we need to quell at every moment in the body. Inflammation is seen as some sort of dirty word, that it is a kind of dangerous condition, and most likely it's because of if you were to cut yourself, the area becomes inflamed and can become infected. But the inflammation or the inflammatory response is the natural mechanisms by which the body comes in to remove kind of pathogens and germs, and basically come in to try and deal with anything like an infection. It triggers the growth of various tissues. It pulls in various metabolites to that area to deal with that damage to the tissue. And remember that fundamentally, when you're doing any training or exercise, the reason that it's beneficial. Oh, there he is.
I'm back. Sorry, guys.
Right. So just so I don't have to edit this, so what I did is I just finished up and said that in terms of vitamin C, we want to be taking in whole foods, and that there isn't a worry that you're not going to be able to consume huge amounts of fruits and vegetables that are going to impact your training adaptation.
Right. Physiological doses, not super physiological. This follows, we actually see this for vitamins and minerals in general, something called like a Hermetic curve or hormesis, this idea that just enough of something is a good amount, that too little is harmful and too much is harmful. You can't take mega doses of most vitamins and minerals and expect a benefit. But you can expect benefit if you're consuming them as part of your normal diet, and you certainly should, include plenty of fruits and vegetables and these natural sources of vitamins and minerals, and in particular, in this case, the antioxidants, because it will be beneficial. But just because it's beneficial when you get it from a nice spinach salad or from an apple or an orange or a mango or whatever, doesn't mean that you should go out and purchase a supplement that contains these same items, because it will not have the same effect.
Yeah. And that's because of all the other bits and pieces as well that are bundled in with whole foods. So yeah, we very much promote a whole food diet
right.
for these. I was just in the middle of talking about how inflammation has got a bad rap, and that fundamentally, when we're doing any training or any exercise, the benefit of exercise is because it causes a level of stress to the body, and that stress is going to cause an inflammatory response. So again, what we're looking at here is the difference between the requirement to recover immediately for repeated bouts or this long-term adaptation. So this goes into a few different things. So the main one is that taking anti-inflammatory drugs like NSAIDs, non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs, has been shown to actually impact training adaptation for this very reason, that if you are taking something that is going to halt the inflammatory response to training, you are impacting that training stimulus. So this is where you need to be cautious about things that are that you're doing for the sake of comfort. If you've done a really heavy training session and you feel that you now need to take painkillers, then you're possibly doing something wrong, or you need to you just need to deal with it. I'm trying to think of a better way of phrasing that. If you're training hard, you're probably going to feel fatigued and sore, depending on whatever you're doing. So what we're saying is don't get rid of the pain, because getting rid of that pain may be impacting your, certainly by using drugs, are going to be impacting your training adaptation over time.
Right.
This now also goes into other means of dealing with this inflammation by doing things like cryotherapy and contrast therapy. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I researched these a little while ago, maybe a year and a half ago. I just thought it was interesting. It was stimulated because I took a climbing trip with some friends to Las Vegas, and it was December, great time of year to climb there because it's the desert. But there was a pool at the place we were staying, and the pool was unheated, and so its temp was about 50 degrees. Not sure what that is in terms of Celsius, but somewhere below 10, I believe.
Okay.
or possibly right around 10. Anyway, it's very cold, a very cold pool, and we would immerse ourselves in it for about a minute at a time, just for mostly for fun. I don't think any of us really expected to recover better as a result of doing it, but it did get me thinking, like, because I know that you will see athletes in, you know, larger sports or team sports use cryotherapy. They'll immerse themselves in cold tubs in between after training, and you got me thinking about, does this actually do anything? And the answer, well, we can look at, I'll address it from two different ways. So first, we actually have, there was a study that was done on rock climbers called Effects of 4 Recovery Methods on Repeated Maximal Rock Climbing Performance. And one of they tested 4 methods, one of which was cold water immersion. And the other ones were electromyostimulation of the forearm muscles and active recovery, pedaling on a bicycle at a low intensity, and then passive recovery, essentially doing nothing. And they did find that cold water immersion was slightly better than doing nothing. It was a small study, though, and overall, what we see is that cryotherapy actually doesn't really seem to do that much, if it does anything. And if it does do something, it seems to do it only on like an individual basis, and you can't really predict whether you're going to respond to it or not. But one of the most interesting things that I thought about when it went to it is we have to think about what we're trying to do. I mean, if you listen to me or you read my writing, you know that I'm very big into biological plausibility. So what are we trying to do with cryotherapy? I'll just ask you that question, Tom. What's our goal? Like, what are we trying to do with cryotherapy?
I think what the original idea was to try and quell this inflammatory response,
right?
And also to play with blood flow to this area,
right? So how would we do that? Like, we apply cold, but you know what's really happening when we apply that cold? Well, it'll depend on the method, obviously, but what I'm getting at essentially is, if you just put your arm into cold water, it would immediately feel chilly. But how, you know, if you probed your muscle, if you could somehow take the temperature of your muscle an inch into it, an inch deep, how warm will that muscle be? It'll still, after 10 seconds, it'll be approximately the temperature of the rest of your body. Your skin will be the same, essentially the same the temperature as the water that it's in. Your skin is going to shed that heat very rapidly. But the deeper we're trying to go within the muscle, the more time it's going to take to get there. So there's actually a study that they were trying to examine how long it took to depress the temperature of a muscle at various depths. I don't remember why exactly they were trying to do this. It wasn't so much to prove like that cryotherapy would be challenging, although to me that's what they demonstrated. It wasn't for that reason. It was for some other reason. But what they found, I think, is pretty interesting. Essentially, they found that if you're taking a temp in the muscle at 2 centimeters deep, or a little under an inch deep, so not that far, not that deep at all within the muscle, especially if you're talking about some of the large muscle groups like your quads or your leg muscles in general, then you need to immerse that muscle for at least 15 minutes, but like upwards of a half an hour before you make any significant dent in the internal muscle temperature. Now, if you're only doing a superficial reading, then it only takes like 5 minutes, or like a centimeter down, like a third of an inch, maybe about 15 minutes before you have reduced the temperature of the muscle to approximately the temperature of the medium that you are immersing it in. But if we're talking about more than just superficial temperature, it takes a long time. So I think that's one thing that we need to actually consider when we're talking about something like cryotherapy. Could cryotherapy work? potentially. We have, at least one study in climbers that suggests that it could, but we're not talking about putting your arms in cold water for 2 minutes. We're talking about putting your arms in ice water, so cold water that has ice added to it, and holding them under there for 15 minutes or more, which makes cryotherapy something that is outside of the realm of most people's tolerance. Most people aren't going to be able to do that. And that's considering that the forearms are relatively small muscles that, they're small in diameter. You potentially could actually chill most of your muscle by doing that and reap the rewards of it. In the study that found a benefit, what they did was they would have them hold their arms under the water for 5 minutes, let them come up for 2 minutes, do another 5 minutes, 2 more minutes in between, and then another 5 minutes. So 15 minutes total time with 2 minutes in between in 5-minute segments. So it's a lot of work, and it's going to be painful. If you've ever done cold water immersion, then it's painful. And it has to be a liquid medium because air is just too... It's not cold enough. I mean, it's cold, but it doesn't have the molecular density to transfer heat efficiently. So unless you have access to a walk-in freezer that has temperatures below like 120 degrees, negative 120 degrees Fahrenheit, it's not going to be very effective. And that's going to be even harder to find than just a bath filled with ice cubes and water. But my overall point here is that cryotherapy might work, but it doesn't do that much comparatively. Like, it doesn't actually improve your recovery time or return you to maximal performance in that much better than just passively recovering. And it's going to take a lot of time underwater when you are in pain and not enjoying yourself before you can actually expect those benefits.
Yeah. And I think there is some data to show that it can be a means of acute recovery. But again, if you're chronically doing cryotherapy sessions, sitting in a bathtub of ice or whatever, over the long term, this is not such a great idea. You don't really want to be doing this after every session. It's not needed.
Right.
But perhaps for various other reasons that jumping into an ice cold pool and swimming around might be revigorating and provide some level of recovery if you wanted to have repeated bouts.
Exactly. There's kind of a placebo effect to it. That's the wrong word, but I think it's the easiest way to describe it. It can psychologically make you feel good. Makes you feel like you're doing something, and that might actually do something for you. But it's not going to do anything more for you than any other means of making yourself psychologically happy. And there is some data to say that drinking very ice cold water can have a similar effect. So there's that. And so we've got another one which is called contrast therapy, and it's really just going from hot to cold. And I believe that this is probably related. It's kind of doing two things. By having the heat, it's probably going to change blood flow to the tissues, and act as a means of kind of pumping these metabolites out of your muscle tissue and back and forth. So I think that's part of the recovery point of it. You could talk about saunas or hot steam rooms as being a recovery method. That gets kind of complicated because that's related to things like heat shock proteins and stuff. So that's probably a little bit more detailed than this. But I think these two or these sort of immersion type hot temperature based recovery solutions, professionals are using them, outside of climbing, and maybe some climbers are using them, but I don't think they're worth being too excited about. By all means, have a cold shower or something, and it might be invigorating. One thing I do say though is that, and I saw someone doing this the other day, is again there's this thing of icing your fingers after climbing. Now again, this goes back to a bigger issue, which we won't cover in detail now, but would be kind of recovering from an injury.
And my thought on all this is that you apart from trying to mitigate pain after an acute injury, which cold will do, if your fingers are really hurting, sticking them in ice buckets are going to prevent them from being sore, probably partly because you've now got a really big stimulus of cold, so your brain is more focused on that. But it is also, I think, impeding this inflammatory response. So again, I think you need to be careful that by doing this cooling methods, like icing your fingers with an ice block or something, you don't want to be doing that after every session, because you're wanting that inflammatory response. That's part of the training stimulus. So yeah, stop. I really think to keep that in mind, that you don't want to keep stopping the inflammatory response after training in whatever way. Okay, so let's talk about active recovery oh, Brian's disappeared again. Okay. Sorry, guys. Okay, so I'm going to carry on. So we can talk about active recovery. So active recovery really is, I think, in the biggest part. Hold on, sorry, I'm just typing to him. Is we're trying to really increase the blood flow to tissues and move these metabolites around. This really, I think, is the main point of it. That's why things like passive stretching and stretching in general, and probably you can lump in things like foam rolling, are not doing that much for recovery, apart from, which I'm going to talk a little bit later if we have time, is actually a kind of mental thing in terms of de-stressing. But in terms of active recovery, doing a kind of lighter mobility type work, or going for a jog, as we spoke about on the previous podcast, is we think is a beneficial thing, because you're getting the body moving, you're getting the lymph system to keep going, which works on a pump system rather than your heart. You move your body and it actually causes a differential, and that's what moves the lymph around. So I would recommend that active recovery is a useful thing and can improve your recovery time. Certainly, I think there's data to say that it can impact delayed onset muscle soreness, DOMS. So by doing even some light climbing is probably better than doing nothing. That can also be said. So there has been a big meta-analysis looking at what is the most effective means of recovering strength and power, and massage actually came up high on that one, and it was a massive study. I think it was like looking at 99 research papers. I'll put it in the show notes. But again, they were looking at, and the understanding was that it looks like massage is helping clear some of these metabolites out of the muscle, and causing better blood flow and things like that. I wouldn't think, I've talked about trying not to interrupt these metabolites. I can't see how by doing something like massage that this would negatively impact recovery of muscles. So for instance, getting say a forearm massage, or let's say lat back type massage after a climbing session is going to impact your training adaptations. I don't think that would be the case. Obviously taking supplements would. Okay, so Brian is back.
Again, sorry guys. Internet.
So I'm
a little stormy here, so I think it's cutting out a bit.
Okay, yeah, no problem. So what I just I talked a little bit about active recovery. I won't cover that over again. But now I'm just talking about in my thoughts on massage. So there was a big meta-analysis of about 99 papers that came out that looked at it. And massage actually came out very high on that in terms of one of the best ways to maintain strength and power. And I was just saying that I don't think in terms of getting a massage after training is going to negatively impact the training adaptation in relation to these other things that we're looking at. I don't think it's acutely anti-inflammatory and hence going to be a problem. I think it's certainly it seems to be a beneficial thing.
Yeah.
So that one that kind of falls in with that, like I said, is foam rolling. I think foam rolling can be a type of massage, but it's such a difficult thing to do in terms of its relation to having a proper massage. I think in the local tissue and the local tissue knots, I think we'll talk about, we could do a podcast on these sort of things. So we might do another one on that. Compression garments is an interesting one. So compression garments, the data that I've read, I don't fully understand the mechanism by which they work, because part of the mechanism is the fact that they increase blood flow to the area, which I was trying to find before the podcast how that even works, because in my mind it would do the opposite. In terms of like compression garments for flying on a plane, for like deep vein thrombosis, what you're looking at is that the compression garment is smaller on the ankle than it is going up the leg. So what you're doing is that you're pulling the blood up the leg rather than letting it pooling at the ankle, which is what you're doing if you're sitting still so long. But in terms of compression garments, there's some data that it can improve recovery time. The best scientists I've heard talk about it say that standard compression garments are really not doing that much, and that you need proper pressurized garments. But then I did find another paper that said that the pressure didn't make that much difference. All in all, I think that again, maybe if somebody had money to blow and they were a competitive climber, that maybe they could try something like arm sleeves straight after their competition session, and that may aid them to recover acutely for the next session. But for general folks who are going to be training, every day, then I don't think that would be worth the time. I've seen some people who climb with compression garments on their arms. I don't fully understand why they're doing that.
I think it's just misunderstanding of why you would use them.
I think so.
If they're going to do anything, it's a recovery thing. It's not a performance thing. There's no reason to work out with compression garments on, unless maybe you're trying to do a like restriction.
Oh yeah, sure.
But it wouldn't be effective for that either. So don't do it for that either. Just don't work out with compression garments on. It's not going to do anything.
No, I don't believe so.
And recovery, we don't even have great data there. Like Tom said, there's a suggestion that they could do something, but we don't have a lot of trial repetition. There's a lot of heterogeneity in the trials. So they're all kind of testing different things and with different garments. And as a result, we can't really make any strong conclusions about what they do or how they do it. Yeah.
But what we can say, and if you do listen to other sports scientists, which I urge you to do very much so, is that things like cryotherapy, contrast therapy, active recovery, compression garments are used in high-end sports for recovery because they may have some effect. And if the player or the athlete wants to try these things and they seem to have an impact, then all these tiny little impacts may have a greater effect. But these are really all very marginal, very much in comparison to literally just eating some food, that we speak about. That's the big thing. We're talking about 80, 90, 95% of the recovery that you're going to get is from eating carbohydrates, protein, and fats.
Yep.
It's not going to come from these newfangled wizardry.
Right. Yeah. All of these other supplemental things, like Tom said, they may work, they may not work. You know, professional athletes sometimes use them not because they're robustly supported, but because this is their job and they're paid a lot of money and they have the resources available to try out these things that may or may not work. And even from then, you know, like there's some evidence for like cryotherapy that it harms some people's performance. So it's not like these are well supported. This is just wealthy athletes having, you know, the means to try anything possible to gain an edge. And ostensibly, you know, most likely these athletes also have access to nutritionists and trainers who are also giving them just the rest of that other 95 to 99% of the recovery, which is, you know, a proper diet and eating enough calories and getting enough rest in between matches. You know, they're taking care of everything else already, and they're doing that. And that's where you should be focusing your recovery time, not on finding the perfect compression garment on Amazon, but in making sure that your recovery nutrition plan is adequate and that you're giving yourself enough time to achieve your recovery goals, whether that means maximal performance or adaptation.
Yeah. Okay. So before I speak about what I believe is the greatest recovery method, I've got a very long page of notes about the parasympathetic autonomic system, but I'm actually not going to talk about that on this podcast. But I just want to. The reason being is that I could go on for another 30 minutes, and I think we don't want to make this too long, this episode. So I might turn this into an article and let you guys know. But in general, as I briefly spoke about at the beginning of the podcast, is that we want to balance this balance between being stressed and recovered. And it's pretty fascinating, but your overall stress throughout the day can actually impact you on multiple physiological levels in your body, not just your mind, but actually in terms of hormones, in terms of your metabolism, and it's all related to basically things like cortisol, adrenaline, what's happening with your heart. It's all of these things are coming back into a feedback loop. So I'll turn this into a longer post, but I really want to say that you're going to see more and more talk and articles coming out about the importance of breathing during your training and breathing after your training, trying to bring yourself back into this parasympathetic state, and what that actually looks like and what sort of things that you can do, which actually reminds me, I might plug something. And to be honest, I can plug something because this is my podcast. Is on the 14th of June at the Arch Climbing Wall in London, in Bermondsey. I'm actually running a workshop that includes some of these recovery methods in terms of breathing and body awareness and things like that. So keep an eye out on useful.coach. Actually, there's a page on there already called Reset Send. Go to useful.coach. You can see the workshop there. And if you're in London, then please book a place on that. And you'll get to actually have some hands-on stuff about this vagus nerve control, HPA axis, and all this stuff. It's pretty fascinating. But anyways, I'll leave that. Unless you have another thing, Brian, one of the big things, well, I think is the primary means by which someone can recover outside of energy balance, and that including the food and getting macros, is sleep.
Yes. Yeah, sleep is critical. People underestimate the restorative power of sleep, to, put it somewhat flowery. You got to sleep. Different people need different amounts of sleep. Getting an amount of sleep that feels good to you, usually that's at least 8 hours a night.
Yeah, and we're talking about quality sleep. So,
right.
I think we could probably do a whole podcast on sleep. This is a really easy throwaway comment. We're doing another podcast.
I think we owe our readers, our listeners, about $1 now.
Yeah, exactly. But you will find it, even with a casual Google now, is that you'll see more and more research. And I'll put something in the show notes that sleep is becoming one of the most important, if not the most important, strategies in terms of a performance improver and recovery aid in sports. Sleep has multiple benefits that are restorative, and there are hundreds of studies showing the impact in various ways of sleep deprivation. Let's talk about the simplest ways to deal with it is having a good sleep schedule is the main thing you can do. So making sure that you're trying to go to bed at the same time or waking up at the same time. Mm-hmm. It appears, and anecdotally as well, is that it seems to be more important to try and get up at the same time rather than going to bed at the same time. Is that if you can get up at every day at the same time, it seems to be better for controlling your kind of circadian rhythms, your circadian clock. Obviously, you're wanting to maximize your sleep when you go to sleep. So that would be things like making sure your room is as black as possible, making sure that you are in a cool room. It's not too hot, not too cold. It appears that a slightly cooler room is more beneficial for sleep than a slightly warmer room. That more and more data is coming out looking at blue light and things like blue light that is emitted from devices. So using your devices or checking Facebook or Instagram straight before you go to bed is not a good idea, because these photoreceptors in your eyes can actually get reset or delayed in terms of signaling back to the brain, and I don't know where melatonin is actually released from. I don't know if it's released from adrenals. I don't know. But basically, your body works on a cycle. So you should be slowing down. You should be eating less. You should be keeping away from bright lights as you start edging towards bedtime. Then basically doing the opposite when you wake up, to try and do the opposite. So bright light, lots of food, activity during the daylight times. So I really think that one of the, put it like this, the first question I ask people when I do a kind of a consultation with them as a nutrition client is to ask them about their sleep habits, because that can impact things like performance and even weight loss. So I really recommend, if I could say to you guys, one thing to try and really polish up to improve your training and performance is to get as much sleep as you can, quality sleep. One thing though is that there is enough data to say that napping can actually beneficially impact people who are sleep deprived. But the caveat on that is that if your nap interrupts your nighttime sleep, then it's not beneficial. So if you're sleep deprived and you're having to perform or train, then having maybe I think it's 20 minutes to an hour the most nap is going to be beneficial for you. But as long as it doesn't mean that you're now going to be going to bed much later than you were because you're not really tired. So that's something to think about that.
Right.
Let's see, what else have we got here? Okay. Do you have anything specifically more to add?
No, I think we've covered what there is to cover here. Maybe you have something else to add, but calories, sleep, carbohydrates, getting your nutrients, and getting your rest.
Yeah.
It sounds very basic when I put it that way, and it is in a lot of ways, but these are things that Tom and I both repeatedly see people fail at in terms of recovery. So those are the big things that we try to fix. making
That's
sure that
right.
people are getting enough nutrients, enough calories, enough carbohydrates and protein after the workouts, not meaning like directly afterwards, but in the hours between when they finish their previous workout and when they're going to be working out next. And that also they're getting high quality sleep in between those periods of time.
Yeah. So I do go back and listen to our protein, fat, and carbohydrate podcasts to understand what are the big things in the terms of how much you want to be eating of those. Then you can go listen to the supplement podcast, which is kind of like the icing on the top of how you can improve things. In terms of supplements outside of what we've mentioned already, things like creatine monohydrate, that's obviously going to increase your creatine stores. There are some things that people are trying to use, such as tart cherry extract, that may help with recovery. But I don't think there's enough data to say that these things are doing that much. Again, some of these things may be impacting long-term adaptation. In terms of tart cherry, I actually do recommend that to some people for the sake of sleep. So taking one dose of tart cherry before bed can help with sleep. Same as something like glycine. Another one which I'll probably write an article on, but maybe just to excite those who like this sort of thing, is that part of your nervous system output is controlled by a neurotransmitter called acetylcholine. And it appears that you can deplete acetylcholine in the system, which, and this mainly comes from data on marathon runners. So it's whether the applicability there is not sure. But the point being that choline in the diet, which you're going to find in things like eggs mainly and meat products, is going to be help with building this molecule acetylcholine and also phosphatidylcholine, which is part of your membranes. And very briefly, I think that if your diet is low in choline, which is more likely going to be a vegan diet, then supplemental choline can be beneficial for you. And you're looking at two types of choline, one which would be something like something called alpha GPC or CPD choline, but maybe I'm going to create an article with this, or maybe I might do a joint article for Brian's website, Climbing Nutrition. But like this, this is something I'm looking into more and more, to the point that I actually take alpha GPC roughly an hour to an hour and a half before I do any very hard training or climbing, and I find it actually helps me with concentration. It's actually used as a nootropic in some circles, but maybe we'll do an article on that for you guys. But that's certainly one I think is interesting, and there is some data on it improving power output and things like that. Okay. What else have I got? Well, I've got some other bits that are, I've got some other bits that are outside of this podcast context directly, which we can put on the end here. But is there anything specific to recovery that you would like to talk about before I answer some questions?
No, I think got it covered. Answer some questions. Take it away.
Good. So I had one gentleman on Facebook called Hakan. Hold on, let me just get his name because I think this is important. Yeah. Okay. Hakan Akus. Sorry if I pronounced that wrong, but he approached me on Facebook to just ask about heart rate variability because he had recently got himself a heart rate variability device. And what I would do is I just recommend you go to useful.coach and read my article called Heart Rate Variability for Training and Recovery. And the reason being is that I took like 2 months writing the article, and it pretty much covers everything on the use of a device and why it can be beneficial and where the pitfalls are. And every now and then I go and update it with new research on it. But do go there because that's really going to answer the question there for you, Hakan.
Brilliant.
Did you get any questions specifically?
Nope, I only got that one that I talked about briefly at the beginning, just asking what exactly is recovering.
Okay. Oh, one thing. Carry on. Sorry.
He did add, is adrenal fatigue a factor?
Yeah, good one.
I think that's a hard question to answer because medically, adrenal fatigue isn't recognized as an actual issue. It's not that, like, this shouldn't be confused with saying that people that say they have adrenal fatigue don't feel the symptoms they feel. It's just saying that it's kind of this blanket term that covers potentially a very large range of problems, physiological problems. So it's hard to answer that question because what is actually going on is going to really depend. It's going to impact what the answer is there. But suffice to say, if you're experiencing symptoms that you would describe as, or that you've read described as adrenal fatigue, then it's something to work with your doctor about to talk about. And yeah, it probably will have an impact on your recovery. I mean, it's definitely going to, but it's not something that I think either Tom or I can actually provide a concrete answer on, like what to do or how it affects it. Not just because we're not the right type of professional to ask, but also because it's really going to depend on what's wrong.
And I think that as well, which we haven't mentioned on this podcast, is this notion of overtraining syndrome or being overtrained. Funny enough, I was actually speaking to Hakan again about this, and I like to talk more about being under recovered than overtrained. And the reason being is that the last person I heard, professional sports scientist, said that in her 15 years of working with the Australian Institute of Sport, I think she had seen, 9 people that she would classify as having overtraining syndrome. So, that's 15 years of working with pro level athletes that are doing far more than any of us would ever do. And she saw 9 people who were classified as that. So I don't think that in the average population that overtraining is a real thing. I do think that you can be fatigued and under recovered. And I think that's a better way to think about it. You're not training too much, you're under recovering. This is not to say, though, that there are not things that can be serious. And you see this mainly more with women, something called the female athlete triad. Without too much detail, basically it's women or athletes that are under eating and chronically training. They can basically put themselves into a really fatigued state. And the big thing there being is under nutrition or low energy. So if you are chronically trying to lose body fat and you're riding the fine edge of energy, and you're also doing things like intermittent fasting and 1 meal a day and low carbohydrate and all these sort of things to try and maximize your fat loss, you've got to be very careful that you're under recovering and you're driving yourself into a hole because of that. But then, like I said in the previous podcast, you should be keeping a diary so that you can actually track whether or not your performance is stagnating or going down, and the same for subjective measures, including libido and things like that. So that I think that falls into that. I did have one thing that did pop up. So Eric Horst has a fantastic series that he's running at the moment about energy systems for climbing, which I really I think you should listen to. But he brought up, and a couple of people have asked me about this, and I approached Brian about this as well, is that Eric is not a fan of creatine monohydrate supplementation because he believes that the part of the reason that when you take creatine monohydrate, you pull in water into your muscle cells because you store the creatine with water. And his comments were that this swelling of the muscle tissue can actually impact blood flow, which would cause you to get a greater pump. So I wrote an email to him via his website to ask him some more comments on this and pass him a study, which I'm going to just mention. I haven't heard a review yet, so it would be good to have a chat. But I also asked one of the pro climbers I work with if since he's been using creatine, whether he's had this effect at all subjectively, and he said no. Obviously, that doesn't mean anything, but it's just it's just one person that I know who is trying it. But then I found a study that basically I put on Instagram, and it really was to say that what they did is they found the very opposite. So they said that it is interesting to note that enhanced blood flow occurred only in the group supplementing with creatine and resistance training simultaneously. So literally this study ended up doing the opposite. And even more interesting is that this was a study that was looking at forearm blood flow. And the calf had 32% increase in blood flow, and the forearm had a 40% increase in blood flow. This is after taking creatine and resistance training. So it would be good, obviously, to speak to Eric and find out to clarify what he is worried about. But I don't think so, and I don't think Brian thinks that taking creatine and getting a muscle pump is going to impede blood flow. Neither does this study. We
need to separate the kind of like the overt superficial feelings of what we would call the pump versus like what's actually happening. Creatine, like you just mentioned, as the study showed, it actually increases blood flow. It doesn't decrease it. Now, when you get off a really hard climb and your muscles are pumped and they're hard, it might feel as though you have reduced blood flow, and you probably do because of all the isometric contraction. But it's not because of the creatine. It's just because you've been isometrically contracting your arms. You've occluded the blood flow through the climbing, and the supplement itself is not affecting that. It might superficially increase, like make it feel slightly harder just because there's more water. Muscles might be slightly larger, slightly more turgid, but you have improved blood flow, and that's a positive adaptation. Creatine's not making you more pumped. If anything, it's making you less pumped.
Yeah, it might be making you climb harder, which is causing you to be more pumped. So that could be a
right.
thing. The other thing that came up was, and I didn't do a lot of research into this, was whether alcohol has an impact on recovery. One thing was that it has shown that alcohol can impact glycogen restoration, but it wasn't directly causing that. It was because people were drinking rather than eating carbohydrates.
Yeah.
So maybe we'll do a podcast on something like that in more detail, but I didn't really look into that much data.
Alcohol is such a hard topic because it is a macronutrient in the sense that it gives us 7 kilocalories of energy, but when we're talking about what it's doing to us, it's a drug, and it's very complex. I don't think that alcohol is not going to improve your recovery. It's not going to make your recovery better.
Yeah, I think we can say that.
If recovery is of the utmost concern, then don't drink.
Yeah, and I think it's anyone who knows if you're going out for drinks after training, you're less likely to have a more optimal meal. You're probably just going to have pretzels or something. So I think that's it. Okay, so the last thing, which is very cool, is there are 2 reviews on our iTunes page, and I'm going to read them both to you. So thanks very much. We have 7 ratings of 5-star. So that's very, very kind of you guys. So
Are you cherry picking the data right now, Tom? Are you only giving us the positive?
No, they can go to the page. There's 7 ratings and they're all 5-star. Now there's only two have been written. So I'm going to read the first one, which was by Sebastian808 with the title "More Please!" And his review was "Can't wait for more episodes." So thank you for that, Sebastian. The other one, which is very kind, I'm going to read, is from someone who calls himself Stands Like a Rabbit. And the review is titled "Most Informative Podcast on Nutrition I've Ever Heard!" And he says, Brian and Tom really know their stuff and share very thoroughly. They state the facts, which go against most of the other things you've read and hear about. I think this is because most of the other stuff is either marketing or assumption and people repeating it. Not so with Brian and Tom. They don't tell you to do certain diet. Instead, they tell you why and how a diet would or wouldn't work. I hope they'll keep this going. It's refreshing to hear the truth. So yeah, thank you so much for that. That's very
thank you.
That's
It's
very
really
kind.
kind.
And it's very encouraging as well. Like we've said before, is it gets a little quiet outside of the podcast. You know, when
Yeah.
we're not always sure whether or not you guys are actually listening or enjoying, and you want us to change anything or whatever. So please do leave reviews. I mentioned to Brian just before we started that I think for these two guys, since they're the first two reviews, that we're going to see when Brian finishes his T-shirt printing, we'll post you 2 T-shirts for the ClimbSci reviews there. So
Yeah.
But maybe if others possibly write reviews,
it could happen.
They could happen. They could get a T-shirt.
With the ClimbSci shirts, I'm waiting on the restocking of the color that I'm trying to use specifically. So it might be a bit of time for the ClimbSci shirts. I should actually check to see if they've got them restocked yet. But yeah, they were just out of the color that I was trying to supply in the material on the company. So
they're not tie-dye then. We don't have like tie-dye ClimbSci.
Nope. Tie-dye is something you do afterwards. That's like, I think, the final step.
Okay.
let the listeners do that themselves if they'd like.
Good. Okay. I think that is everything, Brian. Yeah, we have a couple of technical issues there, but I hope this was a really good, an interesting listen. There is so much on recovery. I mean, we split it into 2 podcasts, but like we didn't go into as much details as you could go into with all these sort of things because there's so many different things to talk about. So again, if there is something specific, you know, that you want us to investigate and give an opinion on based on the research that we've done, then let us know. Best place to go is Climbing Nutrition Facebook page. Brian puts the podcast out on that. So please go there. Or you can go to his website, climbingnutrition.com, and you can put a comment or a question there. My Facebook page is there, Useful Coach, if you search for that. And I normally put the podcast release, so by all means put it there. So there's easy ways to get hold of us. Please do ask questions, and no question is a stupid question or too simple. You know, just because we use flashy words doesn't mean that we don't have time to answer questions about, you know, should I eat half an orange? You know, would that be a good thing to eat after recovery? You know, anything that you would like an answer on, please ask. Talking about that, Brian is doing a fantastic series of like kind of Ask Me Anything every Friday, I think, right?
Yep, every Friday. Always looking for questions for that. There's no number of questions that is too many because I'm always running out, and it's just nice to have some variety. Sometimes without that variety, it ends up not necessarily, maybe not being a question that everyone's interested in. I don't answer questions I don't think are going to be interesting to somebody. Obviously, there's at least one person, that asker, the questioner, who's interested. But please send any question that you might have.
Yeah, so you find more information on there, and I think as well is Brian's on Patreon now. So you know, if you've really enjoyed this podcast and you want to support us, then by all means, you know, sign up for Patreon with Brian. He puts a huge amount of content out there on climbing nutrition. Not just recently, but in the past, which is all there for you guys to have for free. So, you know, for the price of a cup of coffee, you know, sponsor him monthly so he can keep doing what he does.
Yeah, there's a whole archive out there now. It's becoming pretty convenient for me because a lot of times people have questions and I already have an entire 2,500 word article written up on it. I can just send them a link to it.
Cool. Yeah, I think that's everything for this episode. I hope that's given you all something to think about and given you some kind of impetus to think a little bit more carefully about what you do post training and leading up to your next session.
Yeah, I think so. Get enough calories, get enough sleep, and then for some specific small measures, there's some other things that you might do, but those are really more dedicated towards these short recovery periods. These you know, more specific techniques.
Cool. Okay, guys. So thanks so much. Thank you, Brian. And I don't think we have a topic for the next month. So hit us up in the social medias if you have a topic that you want us to cover, or even if you want us to carry on the recovery series and talk about something specific. So that's me signing off. I'm Tom Herbert from Useful Coach.
I'm Brian Rigby from Climbing Nutrition, and we'll catch you guys next time on the next episode.
Cool. Thanks, guys. See you.